The wait has been long, but it has been worthwhile, fellow strugglers, because after spending literal years in the Fantasia arc, Berserk is finally entering a new chapter in its storyline. Chapter 374 is the beginning of the Eastern Exile arc, which, considering how the last two chapters of Berserk ended, is kind of self-explanatory. But don't worry if you don't get that, because we'll bring you up to speed on everything you need to know in this video. So, without further ado, this is the full analysis of Berserk Chapter 374. They appear to be Kushan slavers, alright? Or at least that's our first impression, the opening of Chapter 374. Chapter 374's colored cover shows us an image of Serpico and Isidro from the previous chapter, and it's fitting because like Chapter 373, they were a key focus of the opening stages of Chapter 374. In the last one, they were discussing the magical ritual Shirka was going to perform. Well, Serpico was discussing it, Isidro was sulking because he was feeling useless. In this chapter, Isidro makes himself useful by getting some much-needed character progression on his part. The final third of Chapter 373 showed the boarding and capture of the Seahorse from the perspective of the crew we'd been following since the Conviction arc. Massive chained hooks shot into the Man-O-War, chaining it down in place as irisless Kushan warriors that looked like slavers boarded the Seahorse in droves. The final panel showed them discovering Guts in his dark cell. So naturally, this chapter opens from the Kushan perspective. We see multiple Kushan war galleys swarm the Seahorse from its rear and shoot it through with chained scorpion bolts to hold the vessel in place. The drone shot of the situation showed at least a dozen Kushan galleys surrounding the Seahorse from all sides, and the reason they managed to sneak up on Roderick's vessel was because it was a dark, foggy night, and most of the crew was involved in performing magic. As the slavers started boarding the Seahorse, Serpico and Isidro immediately realized something was wrong and headed towards the stateroom where Farnese and the rest were gathered. Serpico managed to stall a few Kushan warriors with nothing but his death stare, and he did that not to remind us he can fight, but because he was unarmed at the moment. After acrobating their way to the deck where the stateroom was located, Serpico and Isidro are surprised by a Kushan warrior hanging off the outside of the Seahorse, and Isidro kicks him off the ship without a second thought. As soon as he does it, he goes to check on the guy and hears a splash that lets him know he's still alive or something, we guess. But the hesitation-free movement of Isidro here is what's key, in our opinion. He's starting to realize that if he wants to stop feeling like he's doing nothing, he's got to talk less and do more. And given that Serpico and Isidro were both featured on the cover of this chapter, we guess both of them are going to be important players in the Eastern Exile arc. Despite clearing the deck, Serpico and Isidro realize that they're too late because Kushan slavers have already boxed in everyone who was inside of the stateroom. While Serpi panics about Lady Farnese's safety, Isidro looks out to the sea and realizes how truly effed the entire crew of the Seahorse was. A raid of this size and scale could only mean that this crew had either been scouting the Seahorse for a while, or that the Pride of Ys had somehow wound up in infested waters. The feeling that these are Kushan slavers come to take away all the good guys into servitude peaks when they break into the area just outside of Guts' cellar, where Azan the mustached knight is sharing some pilfered rations with a couple of guys. At first he thinks his theft has been discovered and he's being punished, but once he realizes that these guys aren't with Roderick, he changes his tune to calling his current situation a punishment for his gluttonous sin instead. The slavers, presumably interested in taking over all assets aboard the Seahorse, force their way into Guts' cellar. But this is where things get interesting. If you guys watched our Chapter 374 predictions video, you will recall that we said these guys could not be with Griffith because they share one distinct facial feature that sets them apart from the likes of Jarif and such: their eyes. Every Kushan that boards the Seahorse looks like a menacing pirate in their own individual rights, but all of them have eyes that are devoid of any other features. There's only one other time we've seen this particular characteristic pop up with respect to the Kushan in the series, and that's when they were just starting to invade Midland. The Bakiraka clan's navy wants the Black Swordsman, but why? Real reason behind Kushan slavers boarding the Seahorse. When Elfhelm was destroyed, most people that have been reading Berserk since the beginning were terrified that we might just be getting Boat Arc 2.0. But thanks to Chapter 374, it looks like that's not going to be the case. If anything, it looks like we're going to be off the boat soon enough, because the Kushan guys that are rounding up the people aboard the Seahorse seem to be preparing them for transportation. When we go back up on the deck, we see Roderick Roderick trying to plead with the Kushan to leave the woman and children unscathed, but he soon realizes the language barrier that exists between him and his captors. Roderick immediately associates the foreign language with the Kushans, and his first mate as well as best mate Magnifico both kind of freak out because of recent developments in the Berserk verse. Before Guts and co. reached Vritannis, the Kushans were invading Midland and Holy See regions relentlessly. Magnifico was personally witness to the supernatural powers of Ganishka, who invaded his family's mansion and tried to kill everyone present using enchanted tigers. However, after setting sail from Vritannis, the only thing they know about the political developments of the mainland is the fact that the last time they were there, the Kushan were invading. The crew of the Seahorse has no idea that the world they knew no longer exists, thanks to Griffith's rise as the Falcon of Light. It's quite possible that every person aboard that ship no longer has the same home or family as they did before they left Vritannis, because now everyone is technically a Falconian. Well, if they survived the Great Roar, that is. Roderick's first mate thinks that if the Kushans managed to infest the seas this far west, then it's possible their homeland of Yiz was also under trouble, and all Magnifico can do is panic as always. But Roderick himself is confused. Once he realized that these Slavas were Kushan warriors, his pleas for leaving the children and women folk ceased, because he started thinking about how different these guys were from the Kushan he'd heard of. According to Roderick's intel, the Kushans were a savage, brutal race that did not hesitate from decimating their targets upon first sight. The Seahorse was being held hostage by at least a dozen Kushan war galleys, and given their sheer numbers, they could have easily slaughtered and violated every person on board that vessel. But the fact that they'd simply taken people hostage and were intimidating them into silence itself tipped Roderick off to the fact that perhaps these guys weren't here to enslave them after all. Perhaps they had a different agenda altogether. When Azan the Mustached Knight was discovered with his stolen rations, he paled upon realizing that the Kushans were going to enter the cabin Guts was lying in, because he knew the mental state the Black Swordsman was in. He was more worried about the Kushans than about being discovered as a petty thief. And honestly, we can't blame him. The panels that depict the Kushans entering the cabin and checking it out plays exactly like a monster movie, because despite dozens of people being there, one guy was sent forward to check if the black beast on the floorboards was alive or not. He took one look at Guts' sword and it sent a chill through the entire room, but our man braved it and kicked Dragonslayer out of Guts' grip. This briefly woke him up, which once again terrified all gathered, but then they did something weird. They brought out chains. The translations for the Kushan dialogues in chapter 374 are all over the place, given that they're usually in Hindi, so it's difficult to say what these guys are discussing amongst themselves, even for native Hindi speakers. The language could also be Sanskrit, given that it looks like the Kushan warriors trying to grab Guts say a little prayer before throwing their chains on him. But let us ask you this, why did they specifically try to chain up Guts? There are a couple of Kushan dialogues we can understand. The guys keeping watch over Azan and co. were talking about how they shouldn't let the horses go here and there and keep them on tight lockdown instead, as well as how they needed to wrap a rope around someone. The dialogues become less intelligible from this point onwards, but here's what we think they mean. The part about the horses could refer to actual horses, but it could also be a mistranslation for hostage, which would then explain why no one on Roderick's ship has died yet. The rope wrapping could be referring to the chaining attempt they were going to perform on Guts, and Studio Gaga does mention this phrase elsewhere in the chapter, but that brings us back to our original question. Why are these guys trying to chain up Guts? Earlier, we told you how Roderick was suspicious of this bunch of Kushans because he himself was still breathing. Before that, we brought up the fact that these Kushans in particular seem to all come from the Bakiraka clan. If you guys are familiar with the series, you should have been able to put two and two together by now, but we'll just come out and say it. The reason these guys are chaining up Guts is because they're here on the world's most precarious rescue mission. The Bakiraka clan were introduced to Berserk as a group of exotic Eastern assassins in the employ of the King of Midland to spice up his chase of Griffith, but as the series has grown, so has their role within it. The Bakiraka clan is, in truth, an exiled Kushan tribe that was driven out of their homeland centuries before Ganishka's family took over control of the region. The Bakiraka are proud warriors who now reside within a hidden mountainous retreat and serve as assassins in order to keep themselves alive. They only joined Ganishka's side during his invasion of Midland because he promised to let them come back home, and this promise was made to the Bakiraka prince, the young master of the Tapasa, the only man from the east who knows what the Black Swordsman is all about, Silat. The last time we saw Silat and the Bakiraka in the story, it was clear that while they weren't exactly guts-aligned, they were at the least against Griffith and his New World Order entirely. Silat personally rejected an offer to join Falconia right before Fantasia was triggered, and he even snooped around inside the city once it was erected looking for more information on this new, seemingly absolute Falcon of Light. Silat has also fought Guts on multiple occasions and knows the man's insane strength and battle prowess firsthand. These Kushan slavers actually appear to be Bakiraka men under his command, and our hunch is confirmed by a brief silhouette of Silat and the Tapasa being shown towards the end of chapter 374. It's clear that the real reason these boys are here is to rescue the Black Swordsman party, but do so with the knowledge of what the Black Swordsman is capable of doing. No wonder they're so scared to approach the guy, because Silat probably told them a few stories about him, and if this isn't enough to convince you, then what we talk about next surely will. However, it will also raise a question. So let's move on to the next segment. Will Guts go berserk after being reunited with one of his oldest friends? How chapter 374 ends. Ever since Silat, Diber, and Rickett flew out of Falconia, after the latter pimp-slapped Griffith and then bazookaed the crap out of Rakshas, we've been waiting to see how their combination was going to become relevant to the story. Now things are becoming far clearer, because turns out Silat didn't just show up to greet Guts with a bunch of strange faces, he brought Rickett with him as well. You remember how we were making fun of the dude who had to open Guts' door and kick Dragon Slayer out of his hands? Well, turns out there might be more to his fear than Studio Gaga simply trying to pull a gag to lighten a situation, because while you can't understand what the Kushan are saying, you can clearly see they're scared witless by Guts. The boys that enter his cabin are peeking off their apprehension, as if they already know what to expect, and when Guts briefly stirs after having his sword removed from his hand, they have a collective jump scare. The boys get it together, speak a word of affirmation, and get their chains onto him. But something must have gone wrong, because towards the end of the chapter, we see the Black Swordsman walking out of his cabin of nightmares. This is an extremely ominous sign for all parties involved, because Guts was unable to stand just a chapter ago. Even in this chapter, he's not exactly all there. He wakes up when Dragon Slayer is removed from him, sees what happened, tries to grab the sword again, but then passes out. Seeing him walking, with not a sign of a Kushan warrior in sight, tells us that he's allowed the Berserker to take him over again. And that's bad in all caps for the Seahorse crew, the Kushan guys, and probably for the fishes living in the ocean as well. But there is one silver lining in that there's one guy in amongst the countless unfamiliar Kushan that Guts could recall as his friend, and that's Ricketts. Recall that Rickett even going away with Silat was a major turning point in the narrative, because Silat realized that this kid knows something about Griffith the rest of the world doesn't. Well, Rickett is the only person who has laid a hand upon the incarnated God Hand member's physical body, so he clearly is uniquely involved in his story. Combine that with the deep astral knowledge of a guy like Diber, who was Ganishka's wizard general, and the battle prowess of what appears to be hundreds of Bakiraka clan members, as well as the mages of Elfhelm, and you have a pretty good Griffith containment team shaping up in our opinion. But the matter of Guts going berserk remains still. Shirka is currently traveling to Falconia as a luminous body. She can't help him. Griffith has Casca trapped in Falconia with him, so the Moonlight Boy can't help him. Maybe Diber can if he knows how to deal with the Berserker armor's OD, but that's a bit of a stretch. The only thing we can imagine that will stop a Guts rampage could be Farnese and Rickett somehow pulling off what the Moonlight Boy and Shirka did at the shoreline of Britannis, but that's the best case scenario. The chapter ends with a close-up on Rickett's doe eyes, and they look shocked to behold a Berserker Guts. As Roderick's narration tells us, we've entered yet another strange land. Maybe old friends are more powerful than your internal drive for vengeance against the man that defiled your wife and son and then kidnapped them to boot, but our money is not on that kind of positivity. This is Berserk, and struggling is what we thrive at in this series. Expect the people aboard the Seahorse to be in for the fight of their lives in the next chapter, assuming we pick up with Boat Arc 2.0 in the next chapter. Marvelous verdict. But as for this chapter, that's all we have for you guys. What did you think about chapter 374? Did you enjoy it as much as we did? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section down below. If you enjoy our Berserk content, then you might want to hit that subscribe button and turn notifications to always, because we'll be dropping our chapter 375 predictions video soon, and you wouldn't want to miss that. Give us a like and share this video with your fellow strugglers. We'll see you guys in the next video, and until then, keep struggling, my dudes.